Right, thank you. So this work is, this presentation is based on work conducted during the project. As Adelma mentioned right at the outset, we started this 52 months ago. And one of the first areas we covered was work we did looking at policies and governance impacting on food value chains from the European Union. So I'm going to take us back to that and then take us forward to what this might tell us about the current political agenda which the European Union is pursuing, particularly the farm to fork strategy. So I will talk briefly about what I mean by policies and governance, these concepts, and then just move on to some of the work we did on the policy and governance impacts at the start of the project in the early part. And in terms of food value chains, we were really looking at three areas of policy that we thought were of paramount importance. First was around fairer trading practices to try and achieve these. Secondly was around food integrity, the safety and authenticity. And thirdly, sustainability, which included resilience to some extent. But what we were particularly interested here was the food value chain dimension of sustainability, and that was the extent to which we can see collaborations along food value chains and how they're being promoted and impacted by policies and softer forms of governance. I'm then going to move on to another body of work we did, which has been mentioned in a couple of presentations already, and some of the more specific findings in this have been outlined on governance of European food value chains. And from both those studies, we did do some work with stakeholders. I'm just going to throw out what some of their recommendations or the things they thought were important were. And finally, I'll relate these findings to the current farm to fork strategy to give some messages to how that might be implemented, because there is obviously a large leap between strategy and actual implementation of policies on the ground. As I mentioned here, this initial work started in 2017 to 18. And during that period, we've had the Unfair Trading Practices Directive, the Green New Deal, Farm to Fork strategy. So the early work actually was from really analysing work in the last commission and previous commissions. So in the final part of this, I'll try and update that a bit more. I just want to say also that although I'm presenting this, the work done from the University of Hertfordshire was carried out largely by a group of research fellows who were engaged on the project. I just want to mention them. So that was Rosalind Sharp, Calliope Milona, Jennifer Gresham, who worked on the governance, and more recently had support from Kelly Parsons, who's helping us today as a coordinator and collecting the questions and answers. Also, this work involved a substantial amount of research done by other partners beyond Hertfordshire. And indeed, most of the people presenting today contributed to the voluminous reports, which I'll mention at the end, which this very brief presentation is based on. So I want to thank all my colleagues on that. And I will lead you to where you can find these more detailed studies at the end. So in terms of policies and governance, the way we characterize this was to start with what are the policy competences which give the legal authority or broader strategic policies which are set out. And then under these broader strategic policies, you have more specific legislation which comes in, regulation directives and agreements, but also there's a whole range of other instruments which the European Union and the Commission utilize, and these are what we might collectively call soft law. These are the modes of governance as opposed to direct governing, which regulation tends to infer. And here this Commission seeks to influence policy beyond direct regulation through voluntary agreements with key stakeholders, pilot activities to steer stakeholders in the policy area to change their actions. Hopefully this arises through shared learning and based upon evidence and good practice generated. And this can often be right across the European Union member states. So we really see that at the European wide level. But then of course we have multi-level governance. The actions are carried out through national level laws, some of which may not be European Union policy as such, but are initiatives taken at the national level. And indeed that was the case in many aspects regarding fair trading practices in the food supply chain, which were initiated prior to the Unfair Trading Practices Directive. There may be state-led governance actions, of course, where soft law again is used at the national level and also at the regional and local levels. And there were some good examples, particularly from Northern Italy in the studies of regional local initiatives. So these governance modes incorporate stakeholders from the private sectors, business industry, professions, NGOs, and civil society organizations as well. Then on food value chain governance, what we find as our guiding, what was a sort of outcome of this and a real key element around the dynamics of food value chains were the asymmetries of power and information between actors in food value chain relationships, for example, between buyers and sellers. As a result, we get unequal distribution of value of the final product to the different actors along the food value chain. And as a result, in this piece of work, which was separate to the initial one, we investigated the governance of food value chains for societal, political, and policy contexts and interventions, the relationships between the actors and businesses along the value chains, and tried to identify the policy and governance dynamics, which is an iterative process of negotiation and compromise entailing power relationships between actors and across governments and public agencies, but also involving private sector and civil society. And some of that was captured very nicely in Nina's diagrammatic representation of the aquaculture value chain. Particularly, we identified and drilled down on themes of fairness and transparency when looking at the governance of each food value chain. The ones we looked at have been mentioned before. The list is on the first column here: dairy cow to liquid milk, crossing France, Britain, and Germany, all individual studies done by different partners in the project. Beef to cattle, Britain and Germany, farmed salmon from Norway, wheat into bread in France, and processed tomatoes in Northern Italy. The factors we looked at included value chain, structure and production, processing, industry structure and concentration or diversity, contractual arrangements, price negotiations, how those are carried out, trade and consumption patterns, different EU and state-led, so national level regulatory interventions which occurred in each of the specific value chains, and governance initiatives arising from corporate and societal actors as well. For example, voluntary initiatives taken by industry in the by the dairy industry, etc. We did, as I say, have a couple of parts of the research where we interviewed or surveyed food value chain stakeholders. And in the case of the initial work on policy and governance impacting in the three areas that we identified: fairness, food integrity, and sustainability collaboration, areas where in the survey we got findings which suggested that the majority or the larger number of stakeholders wanted policy to go further. In fairness, it was about nationally setting minimum wage levels, so very much about the social sustainability, and special laws to protect seasonal or other precarious food chain workers. So the labour area was an area where it was seen where policy developments weren't sufficient currently. This is going back, as I say, to around early 2018. Food integrity was about addressing the main food fraud was the main concern. Safety, authenticity, safety was broadly seen to be effective, but in terms of authenticity, it was food fraud was the real concern. On sustainability collaboration, EU competition policy was seen to give barriers to further progression, and this is around the issues of collusion and being anti-competitive. There's strong support also for hard and soft approaches to collaboration, that is, having regulations coupled with voluntary agreements, such as codes of conduct, but certainly going beyond just corporate social responsibility, although we know that a lot has been achieved in that area. Most agreed that actors were not taking sufficient action to ensure environmental performance in their chains. And there's also still, at that stage, uncertainty of the adequacy of methodologies to measure environmental impacts. In particular, the retailers we surveyed were unconvinced about how adequate the current methodologies were. In terms of stakeholders, when we looked at the governance of food value chains, which was the following year of the project, we did, I think there were about 50 interviews carried out across the various, in total across the various value chains. And these are some generic things which came out of that. Views and fairness tended to focus on price setting and the means by which pricing decisions were arrived at. That is, how standards were interpreted, and these may be things like the Eurogrid, which are European agreed standards, and therefore priced by the processors and or retailers, whoever the next important figure in the chain was. So the fairness was very much around price setting, pricing decisions, the volumes required, and the interpretation of standards. They rarely mention the generic contract criteria, which are found in the Unfair Trading Practices Directive. So in a sense, you might say that that's been addressed. What this clearly showed, however, was that there was subjectivity at the forefront in the views of stakeholders over issues such as price negotiations. And this has to be considered when assessing fairness in value chains. There is it's about perception as well as hard evidence in that sense, I think, or put it this another way, the perception is an important part of the evidence. There are clearly differences according to the particular sector. So there's quite a difference in the dynamics in the dairy milk chain from wheat to bread. And as a result, there's a growing awareness, I think, now that policy interventions, as well as being generic, need to be focused on the needs of a particular sector, be it the dairy sector, the processed tomato sector, or the salmon sector, etc., or aquaculture sector, if you like. So finally, some farm to fork strategy. On the farm to fork strategy, some messages arising from our research. Well, as I say, a lot of this earlier research was undertaken before the farm to fork strategy was released and while it was being formulated. So it is quite refreshing and rewarding to see that a lot of the concerns raised in our early work as being gaps are being addressed by the farm to fork strategy, and indeed that brief cartoon that you may have seen at the very beginning was in relationship to our findings on this. So one example is the strategy wants to ensure that the key principles enshrined in the pillar of social is respected, especially when it comes to precarious, seasonal, undeclared workers. And that was one of the things we identified. But I think the means will be very important, because we found there are already a wide range of existing soft law initiatives, but often they have national derogations in them at EU level. And more recently, proposed amendments to the Common Agricultural Policy to make subsidies conditional upon farmers upholding working and employment standards have proved to be controversial with the farming stakeholders. So, as I say, there's going to be quite a leap between the strategy's intentions and the implementation on the ground. On food integrity, food fraud is identified, and ways of trying to improve that across the European market are identified in the farm to fork strategy. However, one of the things we did find in a couple of member states, at least, and I suspect this is going to be increasingly true as budgets are strained post-COVID, is that we'll need adequate investment and budgets for national enforcement authorities from member states, as well as careful monitoring from the Commission in order for the interrogation and monitoring of food fraud to be successful. And finally, on sustainability collaboration, again, clarification of the competition rules in ways that can promote and support the Green New Deal have been identified as part of the strategy, and DG Competition has made a call for evidence and views on this. And one of the things that we identified was, and has been identified by stakeholders as well, for example, by our own retail, food retail trade beak association in the UK, was there may be need for a public interest goal to be incorporated into competition policy that goes beyond the health of the consumer in terms of prices and fairness, that we need to think more generally about the public interest as well as the consumer interest. The farm to fork strategy also proposes sustainable labeling framework, covering a whole range of what we would see as sustainability aspects, and a code of conduct for responsible business and marketing practice, accompanied by a monitoring framework. All of this, of course, requires coordinated and transparent measurement and monitoring. And that probably isn't in place at the moment, and is something which a lot of people are researching and advocating, including industry as well as academics. The work done by Nick Holden and the other colleagues that was presented here is an example of that. But what we don't see at the moment is this turning into specific policies on the pricing of food and drink products. For true transparency, we're going to have our food and drink products to reflect the costing of the negative externalities. Okay, so that's just some of the, and very briefly presented and summarized and selected features from a lot of work that was undertaken during the project, particularly during the early and mid sections of the project, some of it now updated. It's not a comprehensive review of the farm to fork strategy, but it does provide some of the insights that our research has found and ways hopefully that can inform the Commission and other policymakers moving forward. We have got research briefs which look at that more thoroughly. My contact details are here. These are the places where the two major deliverables upon which these summaries were based. The first one is the one looking at the impact of various policy and government dynamics on those three areas. That's over 300 pages. The last, likewise, a governance one, which has a variety of chapters and a summary chapter involving a wide range of our partners in the project. There's 237 pages, so it's a substantial piece of work and well worth looking at if you want a more detailed examination. But for those who don't, there are project briefs available which summarize both of those work package deliverables, and they're available also on the VALUMICS website. Thank you.